Byrne, first and foremost, I just want to thank you for making the time, especially given the chaos going on in Texas.
Thank you. It's a great break from the near apocalypse.
Awesome. But let's just get rolling. And I'm, again, so excited that you're here. And Byrne, I think pretty much everyone who is on the call is either a reader of yours or familiar with your works. But I guess I might as well get like the 1 or 2 minute pitch on your background and really how you started to write, and more specifically, when you started to write independently and spin out your own publication at this point.
Yeah, happy to chat about all of that. So my background is pretty much 50-50 tech and finance, probably a little more finance than that. But I worked a long time ago in online marketing, and I got this idea after a while that I could use some of the marketing tools that I was playing around with to do competitor analysis or build AdWords campaigns or help companies rank better in Google, that I could use some of that to track how companies that were publicly traded were performing. And I got this idea at around the time that the dot-com nuclear winter had finally come to an end, and there were actual internet companies going public pretty regularly. So this was in 2011. You had LinkedIn, Pandora, a company called Demand Media, Shutterfly. A lot of these companies, they had been in business for a while, and the idea of taking an internet company public had been somewhat discredited, but it was coming back. And so I realized there would be demand there. And through doing some of that work as a consultant, I ended up working at a hedge fund, SIC Capital, and I was basically doing a lot of similar work for them, just trying to understand internet companies, how they work, how people find them, how changes upstream in distribution can actually affect these companies. And there have been various businesses that have been just destroyed or created by some policy change at Google or Facebook or any of the other major internet companies. That's a lot of my background as a, I don't know what you call it, but as an analyst, is understanding those supply chains of attention. In off and on for a really long time, going back to even before I finished high school, I had been blogging about investing in the stock market and things of that nature. And I started writing more regularly a couple of years ago, and just basically putting down any thoughts on interesting financial phenomena or economic history, or thoughts on careers and risk tolerance and the nature of volatility. Just anything I thought was interesting that I would want to read. And over time, that gelled into a more consistent beat. I ended up mostly talking about inflection points and mental models. So inflection points, anytime something was one way for all of history, and then it started going in some different direction. I think inflection points are really interesting. They're really informative. And I think mental models are really powerful. I almost never use the term mental model in my writing, but a lot of what I'm trying to do when I write is extract some common patterns. For example, a couple of days ago, I had a newsletter issue about refoundings. And refounding is just, there are a lot of companies and institutions that exist for a really long time. They worked really well for a while. They start working less and less well, but it's never terrible. It's always the kind of place where you'll have a really good career and a lot of job security, but you won't change the world. And then something changes at those companies, and they do start trying to change the world again. And that often involves a new leadership team. Sometimes it involves a leadership team that just changes their mind about something and says, we're going to accept doing much worse at what we are good at right now in exchange for writing a more promising S curve that takes us to a much better place in the future. So that's a useful model to extract. So anyway, that's the beat. I was doing some writing just for fun. I started doing commission pieces for Medium and a couple other publications like CoinDesk, Palladium, a few other places. And I actually was just pitched by Substack on starting a newsletter. So I had been using a MailChimp newsletter just to distribute links to my articles and other links I thought were interesting. But I tried out Substack and was using it for a couple weeks or a couple months as a free user. And that was my intention, was just, here's a really simple, straightforward platform, very easy to use, so I'm going to use it. And then they pitched me again on creating a paid product. So I decided to take that for a spin, and I put together a whole financial model of, here's what I can do freelancing, here's what I think I can make from consulting, here's what I can do with a newsletter. And so I had these predictions. I thought, okay, my life is, I pretty much know what 2020 will look like. So this was January of 2020. So I had a really good idea of what 2020 would look like as of January. And everything I thought about 2020 was wrong. But fortunately, one of the things I was wrong about was how big the newsletter could get. So it grew a lot faster than I expected, and more people converted to paying subscribers than I thought. So it actually ended up being self-sustaining. And it's So most of my income right now is from writing the newsletter. I also do some investing in public and private companies. I also do consulting. I've had to really winnow down the list of companies I consult with, but I do some consulting as well. And that's really fun. I think there's always this balance, which as I got older, I started reading really well-written things by someone younger than me, like novels written by someone who was 22 at the time. And I just felt like these people are really arrogant. Like they haven't actually had as much life experience that I have, and yet they know things about the human experience that I don't know. So either they're really good at this stuff or they've just had experiences that I have totally missed out on. But it does make me think that I should try to lean into having actual business experiences rather than just reading news and writing commentary on it, because you can drift off in all sorts of crazy directions if you are a pure theorist. And if you're purely practical and you never try to figure out the theory of what you're doing, then you can also get lost in just totally different rabbit holes. You can optimize yourself really well for a set of circumstances that's temporary, and if you don't understand why it's temporary, then you can do very badly when things change.
It's actually that's such a perfect segue into, I think, a theme that's going to weave throughout the conversation, which is that what I think is so interesting about a lot of your writing, A, the writing itself is extremely compelling, but B, I think a lot of the proof that you have towed this line between maybe practice and theory very well are the quality of your readers. I've heard Patrick Collison from Stripe talk about the Diff, and I know that you've really found a lot of success with, I think, people who are really putting a lot of these ideas into practice. So maybe I'll start there and just ask you how you pick what to write about, how you think about your angle on topics. And there's going to be a whole bunch to unfurl there, but maybe I'll start with kind of that open-ended question.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have an especially systematic way. I think part of what I do is I read a lot. I have probably a couple hundred RSS feeds. Because of the power outage, I got to see how much accumulates in the RSS reader if I leave it alone for 24 hours. And it was like 1,100 articles. I don't read them all, but I do read a lot. And what I'm trying to look for is any kind of interesting pattern, any kind of case where there is a mental model that's available to one industry that applies to another industry but isn't being used there. So there's just a lot of ways that if you look at a lot of different businesses, you can say this company looks like it's unrelated to this other company, but they're actually the same business. I think if you look at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, which is the semiconductor foundry company, and you look at Costco, when you really break it down, in both cases, they are in the business of making these very large, hard to unwind capital expenditures and using that to spin up a very high margin, recurring revenue kind of business. It's not quite recurring in either case, but with Costco, you treat almost the entirety of the Costco business as something that nets out to break even, and then they make their money on memberships, and memberships are extremely high margin. And if you net out the actual business of selling, I think it's like one in 200 or one in $150 of all the consumer spending in the US, you net that out, you say they don't actually make money doing that, then really the way they make money is they buy some land, they put a store there, and that allows them to sell more memberships, and that creates recurring revenue. And Taiwan Semiconductor is also a business where they write absolutely enormous checks in order to build one cutting edge factory. And there's a brief moment in time where that factory is the only one that can produce a particular category of chips. And then they make as much money as they can from that. And then it depreciates to zero in fairly short order. So it's Costco does it in space and Taiwan Semiconductor does it in time. But in one sense, they're the same kind of model. There are not a lot of people who have Costco and Taiwan Semiconductor on their list of companies to follow. There are some, like those companies are both actually somewhat popular to read about, talk about, try to understand, but they're also unique and hard to copy. So when you do try to understand them, you're not trying to read everything you can about Costco so that you can build a business that sells everything with a 13% markup instead of a 14% markup, and that's how you're going to destroy Costco. No, you want to find the Costco of some other industry, and it's going to look totally different, and people will only realize after the fact that it's described in the same way that Costco is. I guess that's the kind of pattern that I look for, and reading a lot is a good way to find those patterns. And sometimes they're just lurking questions. So if I'm trying to figure out why a particular company behaves in some way, or why is X always a problem, like one of the lurking questions I had for a long time was, why is it that big cities have notoriously bad public services? Like usually big cities tend to have not great public schools. They tend to have not great garbage collection. If they have public transit, they often have strikes and it's super expensive and no one understands why. And then small towns seem to function a lot better in many of those respects. If they have those services, the services are generally pretty okay. And I was wondering about that correlation. I realized that part of what's going on is that cities have this superstar dynamic where there's some industry that is really concentrated there. And so if you want to work in that industry, that's where you should go. And this was a compelling theory in 2019 than it is today. It's still true that if you want to make it really big in movies, you shouldn't make a list of the 10 best places to be a movie star in America and then say, oh, number 8, that's actually really good cost of living. I'm going to go there and fulfill my dream of being a movie star. No, you have to go to LA. You still do. What that means is that everyone who's in those industries, they move to those places, they raise the cost of living, they can make more money there than they could elsewhere. But that means they raise the cost of living for everybody else. And so other things get priced out. And a lot of these public services are actually pretty labor intensive. It's really hard to pick up the garbage without hiring a lot of people to drive garbage trucks. And so you need to find people who are willing to drive garbage trucks. And there's sticker shock. So if the people you would need to hire, if the market clearing wage is like 130K for someone to drive a garbage truck, and maybe that is actually what some of them make if the union's really good at their job, it can be hard for a municipal government to actually agree to pay that much money. So they generally just accept lower services, pay slightly less money. And so the quality of life in big cities is a little bit worse in those respects, but it's really good if you work in that core industry and if you really value having a lot of peers in the same industry. So that's another example of something that's just a lingering question. It's not something where it came up, someone asked, and I had to come up with an answer. It was just something I'd wondered about for a while, and I finally got around to digging into it and figuring it out. I think having a background in history, economics, knowing a bit about some of the big tech companies, I think that's really helpful. You get a lot of models you can apply to a lot of different situations, and that means you're not starting from zero. But it can also be misleading because all these models are simplifications of the real world, and they're often really illuminating simplifications, but they do still simplify. I'd say another really good source of ideas is look at confusing behaviors by people and organizations that you respect and try to come up with the smartest reason they could be doing what seems like a dumb thing to do. And this actually gets to what I think is one of the problems with tech journalism in general is that there is this bias in journalism, which is actually fairly healthy, of we're going to find people who are prominent and we're going to take them down a peg. We're going to figure out if there's a politician, we're going to figure out what their scandals are. If there's a big company, we're going to figure out what the sneakiest thing they've been doing to their customers or suppliers or to the government or whatever is. And I think it's a healthy counterbalancing. Like obviously, if the institutions are powerful, then you want to have some equally powerful counterbalance to keep them from just taking over the world. But where that gets tricky with pre-IPO tech companies in particular is that the payoff from investing in a good company, it is a strong power law distribution. So if you are investing in pre-IPO companies, you expect the median investment to lose money. You think that the better your career is, the more it will be attributed to just one well-timed investment. And what that also means from the company's perspective is they pitch a lot of people. Almost everyone they talk to, if they got in the door, the investors they talk to think this could be a viable company. And eventually they get rejected by anyone who thinks that their valuation is too high. And what that also means is that if you have a company that pitched to 50 VCs, 5 of them wrote checks, that means that 90% of people who thought this could be a good idea thought it was overvalued, which also means that the view, this company raised a bunch of money and they're overvalued and this is a bubble, that is actually the median view. That is the default viewpoint. And 90% of the time it will be right. Like 90% of the time that valuation was too high. So if you weight it by accuracy, a lot of skeptical journalism about tech companies is totally accurate. If you weight it by returns, it's very inaccurate because the tech consensus, like the tech journalism consensus portfolio, would have been short Facebook at about a $55 million valuation. And so they would have lost a little bit of money on that one. So what I try to do is, it's not so much that I think these companies can do no wrong. It's that I think that when they make mistakes, they probably make more sophisticated mistakes than people give them credit for. And you should come up with the most sophisticated possible excuse for why these behaviors might have made sense to somebody, because that at least gives you some insight into the research process. It lets you reverse engineer a little bit of the thinking that went into these decisions. And I think that's powerful. I think reverse engineering the decisions of successful people who won't necessarily tell you all of their decisions and who will definitely, after they've succeeded, will give you a very cleaned up story. of how it happened, how they had this idea and they just executed it in a straightforward way. They never had to compromise anything, never had to run ads in their social network that violated people's privacy, never had to cynically fire someone just to get some stock options back in the employee options. Like they always, the story is always a really nice, smooth, linear narrative, but the actual reality is always a bit messier. And I think it's the most positive version of the messy reality is why, if you were at SoftBank and you were in charge of doing the last WeWork deal, what was your plausible case for getting a good return on your WeWork investment? Because that's going to be way more interesting than the really obvious point that WeWork was losing a ton of money.
God, I just love this because I think if I were to make any social commentary here, it's like the world is starved of nuance. And I think these are more interesting questions than the typical kind of, you can maybe call it surface level news. I'm curious, when you start to get an intuition that you're on to an interesting question, that there might be an interesting story, how do you filter out what you think your audience will really want to hear? And how do you channel your own curiosity into focusing things that Diff readers, you're pretty certain they'll be curious to hear about?
Sure. The diff is named after the Unix utility diff. So it's just you take two files and you want a list of all the ways they're different. So I think of it as here's the consensus and here's my view. And we're just going to extract the cases where my view is radically different from the consensus. So I generally assume that people know the basic background of whatever I'm writing about. And that I think there's a complicated trade-off there. There's this wonderful bit in the movie and book Thank You for Smoking, where the main character is a cigarette lobbyist. He says that whenever he trots out a piece of historical trivia, he always introduces it with "of course," because no one's going to admit that they didn't know that some particular sultan of the Ottoman Empire banned smoking and ordered anyone who smoked to be beheaded. But if you say, "Of course, sultans made smoking a capital offense," everyone feels like I could have known that. I should have known that. I'm the kind of person who would have known that. And so I'm a little bit flattered too. I'm flattered that this guy's on my level. So I don't go that far, but I do generally assume that people in my audience know how Facebook makes its money. People know what a treasury bond is. They know what an option is. They know what a hedge fund is. I will sometimes explain things a little bit, and sometimes I'll actually do a write-up on a concept where I think there's a subset of readers who would be extremely bored with an explanation, and then there's a larger set of readers who have not used that concept before. So one example of that is the concept of duration, which is it's a piece of bond math where if you've ever had to take a class on finance or if you've ever been involved in fixed income in any capacity, you know what duration is, but a lot of people haven't. And bonds don't yield very much right now. So nobody's really excited to trade bonds. So for a lot of people, duration is just not something they have to know about, but it's a useful financial concept because as it turns out, the maturity of a bond is also related to how sensitive is to interest rates, and you can use duration to think about a lot of different streams of returns. And in particular, you can look at a lot of tech companies as having these very long duration assets. So Google, we can be pretty confident people will still be Googling things in 20 years, that Google will still be making a lot of money from their ads in 20 years. And when interest rates decline, the numbers, like the 2040 free cash flow number, actually becomes a lot more salient than it was when interest rates were high. So duration is a really important concept. I have readers who work at fixed income hedge funds, and if they saw me start into a 5-paragraph explanation of what duration is, they feel like they're reading the wrong newsletter. But I also have readers who work at companies like at small tech companies where they've never owned a bond. They don't have any reason to own a bond. And so just assuming that everyone knows bond math is a waste of time. So in cases like that, I'll just do a separate write-up, throw it up on Medium and say, here's duration. If you don't know exactly what duration is, read this write-up and you will know. And then here's my piece on applying duration in some weird way that it is not usually applied. So that is one way to appeal to audiences, is just assume that they are pretty well informed, and then if there's any doubt, then try to separate out the background knowledge from the main piece. Other stuff, part of the way that I write the diff is I try to ask myself, if I were retired, let's say I've made some money somehow, I have enough money to live on, and one of my goals is maximize returns over an extremely long period. So make sure that my great grandchildren have really nice trust funds. There are a lot of themes I have to pay attention to. There are a lot of things I have to totally ignore, like just day-to-day politics news. It's really not going to make a big difference in the 100-year return on a portfolio. But there will be trends where if you catch the trend 10 years early or a generation early, then you make a lot more money than you otherwise would have. And there are some old money families that have just been really good at catching those trends quite early. So the Rockefellers made a lot of their money in the 19th century, but they were also very early into venture capital. And so they are not still in the business of selling the world's most cost-effective replacement for whale lamp oil.
It's a shame though, because I think it could make a comeback with the power outages. Yeah, that's what an amazing filter. One thing we talked a little bit about before we got started is just like the relationship you have with your readers and maybe the back and forth you get now really publishing. I mean, you publish every single weekday. So I'm really curious to hear how the feedback and reactions you've gotten maybe over the last 12 months of doing the Diff full time have shaped your writing, your thinking, and what you want to do with this.
Yeah, yeah. So reader feedback is really wonderful because once you have a decent sized email list, if part of your shtick is that you're a generalist and you do deep dives on different topics from day to day, it's nearly always the case that you're writing about something that one of your readers knows a lot better than you do. And so the goal is probably not tell that person something totally mind-blowing they've never heard before, but it is at least to show that you can speak intelligently on the topic despite not having spent most of your career in it. So I've had really wonderful pieces of feedback. I wrote about one fintech company and got an email back from someone who had worked with some of their modeling really early on and had some interesting thoughts on that. I wrote a piece on the phenomenon of the Mittelstand, which are these mid-sized German companies, often family owned, that they usually sell one little component or a set of components that is part of some industrial machinery, and they've been doing it for 100 years and they're super high quality and it's really hard to compete with them, and they always stay the same size and they're like a large extended family, and they're also literally family owned in many cases. And so I wrote about how the software business is evolving into that, where you have all these little-ish companies that sell some essential component to a set of other companies. They don't want to take over the world, but they're going to be a nice cash flow generating business for a really long time. And I actually got a nice email back from someone who is from Austria and knows people who have inherited companies like that, or he's worked with companies like that. So he was able to give me some more background on why these companies exist and what the economic drivers are. I had thought that it was a case that I thought it was an economic organization that could just evolve over time. It turns out that some of it is because of weird quirks of German inheritance tax law that actually encourage people to hand things down and hand businesses down and keep them in the family and keep them employing a set number of people, which is a really good way to make sure that you have these businesses that are very conservatively run, that don't get huge, but they don't go away. It turns out to be a more complicated story than I thought, but still a useful analogy. And I think that's what I aim for with reader feedback is I want to find out the story is more complicated than I thought, but not wrong. And that is generally the feedback that I get. So I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, and one thing I was curious about with your maybe getting into a little bit more like the tactics and the medium of doing a paid newsletter is how would you encourage or advise or have you thought about the decision between going paid at all in the first place versus maybe using your audience to find consulting work or freelance work? Maybe I'll start there, but when did you decide that actually paid was a good model for your type of writing?
For me, it was mostly that I was getting good feedback on what I was writing, and I was getting paid for some of the articles that I was placing in other places. So I knew that people would pay for it. And part of what I was thinking was if I write something really good, I do want to capture the upside. And a subscription model is a really good way to get ongoing upside, get those long duration cash flows. And it doesn't foreclose any kind of future consulting. So I definitely have more than one paying subscriber who I've also done consulting for. And so it doesn't actually block any opportunities, but it does enhance some of the opportunities. You could think of it in price discrimination terms where you have you have a large set of people who will just never really care what you have to say. You will have some set of people who will care enough that it's worth their time to read it, but they can take it or leave it. Like they will read something else. That's fine. You have one set of people where they will read almost everything you write, or if you're writing about it, they will assume that it's interesting enough to be worth giving a shot. And those people, you do have to work very hard to make their preconceptions true, but it is doable. And then you have a small subset of people where they want a proprietary version of this kind of analysis just for their purposes, just for their business. And that often means using the data that they have that is not public and using that to come up with more personalized decisions for them. And so you still have some price discrimination abilities there. The other thing with going paid was just I knew that I was able to write a lot. So I felt like I would be able to give someone really good value for the money, charging for the newsletter. And so far that's been true. I'm happy with the subscriber count, happy with the churn rate. So far people seem to like what they're getting.
Yeah, this is something I'm curious to hear more to get your kind of input on. You had obviously been writing and had maybe definitely somewhat of a presence already before starting the diff. But how would you encourage people to think about starting to find their first true inner circle of readers who really are excited and fired up about their work? I think that can be almost the first chasm to cross. And I'm curious how you'd encourage people to think about it.
Yeah, so there are a couple ways to think about it. Like one is just the more broadly tactical sense that there are a lot of cases where there is some low friction, low monetization platform and it feeds traffic into a higher friction, much higher monetization platform. So you can think of people who use Twitter to get attention for their Substack. There are people who are on Instagram and they will link to their OnlyFans. You have a lot of different ways to use this model, but you generally it's hard to get growth on a platform where there are ads everywhere or everything is paywalled, but it's hard to monetize on a platform where everything is shareable by default, so you can't actually charge people for accessing your stuff. So the way to split that difference is you do your growth marketing on the low friction, under monetized platform, and then you do everything else, all the higher value added stuff on the other platform. That said, there's just a difference in media. Like Twitter is really good for having quick reactions. I would say if you're writing middle brow to low brow, Twitter is excellent marketing for you, but it's also really hard to charge people money for that kind of content. So you almost want to use Twitter to signal that you're thinking harder about this than 280 characters can contain. And that's hard to do. And I'm just lazier on Twitter and I care less about my personal brand on Twitter. And a lot of my readers don't read Twitter. A lot of people in the financial services sector don't read Twitter. A lot of people in tech will delete Twitter from their phones prudently, so they don't see me on Twitter. It's in my case, I am just less professional on Twitter and more personal. I think I've barely written anything personal in my newsletter. The latest edition did point out that power had been out, and I wrote some of it in the dark while it was getting colder and colder. But usually, I just keep it pretty view from nowhere. There is another option that I think is a really powerful way to start a newsletter, start going after your target audience, which is something that has a target audience of one and make it someone who, if they shared the piece, a lot of people would read it. And it's not so much that you're writing something that particular person will read as it is that if you're aiming for that tier of quality, then you're probably going to write something pretty good. And one way to do that is if you're, in my case, since I write a lot about finance and tech, I can do this. Writing a profile of a company that is somewhat under the radar and not well known. If you write it from the assumption that you want the CEO to read this and say, this is actually the most thoughtful piece of coverage that my business has gotten, then that's a really good bar to aim for, even if the CEO does not actually read it. I don't know if the CEO of Palantir read my Palantir write-up, but I got a lot of people who worked there, had done business with them, who said that thought the media were like the general coverage of Palantir was pretty negative and was making a lot of easy assumptions that weren't actually justified. And so writing something more straightforward and not super negative was actually refreshing to them. So yeah, that would be another option is if you are writing about companies, pick a company, write something you think that if you worked at that company and you ran that company, you'd think was thoughtful analysis and then publish.
I love that. And in a weird way, almost makes it so much easier to write because you can just, there's not this nebulous sense of who I'm writing for. It's this very specific person. I'm writing this for blank. I can see their reaction as they read it. Seems like a really helpful, practical filter too, as you actually go to write. One thing I failed to mention at the beginning, I want to encourage anyone who's on the call, you're welcome to drop in any topics you want to dive into the chat. I failed to mention that during kickoff, so feel free and we can really dive into anything that seems compelling. So you can use the chat liberally. The next thing I was curious about, and you've touched on it so far, is like this idea of really trying to write things that you can reference 1 year from now, 2 years from now. Somebody could join and really go read your backlog. And I feel like so much of it would still be fun to read months and years later. And I guess I'm curious if that's something you've been very intentional about in your writing and something you really would encourage other people to think through, but just generally how you've thought about turning a piece of news into something really evergreen and how you go about doing that.
Yeah, that's important for a couple of reasons. One is just cowardice that there is so much competition to get the first piece of commentary out about any breaking news story that you're probably not going to do well. And if you care about getting things right, then you really shouldn't be in the breaking news business, because the initial version of the story, like the more interesting the story is, the more likely it is to be wrong. That is something I've written about. In fact, I wrote a piece that I was pretty happy with about the rise of viral videos of just real world stuff that was horrific. And one of the points that I made in that piece was we're at this weird point in history where for a long time almost nobody had a camera. So if something got filmed, it was just dumb luck. And at some point, we will be at the point where everyone has a camera, it's running all the time, uploading all the time, everything will get filmed. Now we're at a point where everyone has a camera, it's not running all the time, which means every viral video starts a couple seconds after things get interesting, because you don't start filming until things start happening. So what you always miss in those videos is the entire backstory of what was happening before this started happening, of who said what first, who did what first, which means that with every story, every one of those videos, you can fill in whatever background you want to fill in. You can tell whatever backstory you want to tell. And that's why there are so many stories that are driven by videos like this that are extremely controversial, because it's not that different people saw different videos, it's everyone saw the same video and everyone came up with their own libretto of what happened, what's the context, and who's at fault. So I think that you could have this naive view that once we have more video, we have more content, it's just hard for anyone to dispute what happened. But no, it's actually even harder to dispute what happened, because you're way more convinced when you see a video that fits your priors, but your priors are not somebody else's priors. That's maybe a piece I wrote that discusses why I don't write that kind of rapid feedback. This just happened and here's what I think about it kind of piece. I do. I try to, if you go back and read just the headlines from 20 years ago, a lot of it is totally pointless. And a lot of the stuff that actually mattered wasn't really put in its proper context. And so a lot of the story, you get these object level things, you get interesting details you would have missed, and no one actually seems to know what was really going on. So I try to write the kind of story where even if even the hook is something that just happened, what it actually talks about is, why is this happening now? Why are people reacting to it the way they are? What happens next as a consequence? That stuff is a lot more enduring. And also, cynically, it's harder to be wrong if you're like, this just happened and we should expect this to happen once a decade over the next 100 years. Nobody's going to notice if it's 2030 and it hasn't happened yet. So you get, like, cynically, you are less likely to just immediately put your foot in your mouth writing about something like this. And I think that's helpful.
Totally. I always think about Ben Thompson he does a pretty good job of self-regulating himself and going back when some of his predictions never came true. But you're right. I think maybe he does have a bit more flexibility when it's on this longer time horizon. So yeah, I love this question from Ergus that just dropped in the chat, which is, you publish something of a very high caliber every single day, every single weekday. And I think for most people, that's mind-boggling. And I think certainly an aspirational place to get. And so I guess I'd just be really curious to maybe just hear a bit more about why you publish daily, how you have kept yourself at that cadence. You mentioned, like, it literally took the state of Texas entering in a state of emergency to miss a day. And yeah, I would just love to hear about your consistency and how you do that.
Yeah, so I did recently change the schedule because I'm working on a book with a friend, and so I'm now spending 1 day a week on the book and 4 days a week on the newsletter, and then I'm giving people who subscribe to the newsletter free copies of the book when it comes out. Everyone's getting the same content, different cadence, and part of that was that I do actually get feedback from people who say, I unsubscribe because it's stressful to have 10 unread issues in my inbox, and I know I won't actually read all of them, so that's annoying. Which is a hard thing to deal with, because it's not, nobody really says the content isn't good enough to read, and nobody says that there's too much. Like, it's complicated. Nobody What people say is, that's too many email newsletters to read, or I don't like the backlog, or whatever. So I think some of it is that the form factor does matter, and there is a point at which the incremental email is not as good as packaging up some thoughts in a book. And a lot of the people who I write for are also pretty avid book readers, and I think it's just a lot easier to binge on books than it is on newsletters in the back catalog. And I think some of that just comes down to the form factor of email, where With a book, you just have, if Ben at Stratechery writes a book, it's going to be 400 pages of Stratechery and it'll all be there and it won't be other stuff. But if you are trying to read a book's worth of newsletters, it's going to be, here's an article on Amazon, and here's a receipt from Amazon for something you bought 2 months ago. And then here's an alert that you missed a message on Facebook. And so there's a lot of noise mixed in there, and people don't sort their inboxes that much. People mostly search, and they shouldn't sort their inboxes because you can search. But it does mean that when stuff accumulates, it's not a great reader experience. I have exactly one reader who does this, but I think everyone should do it because it would make me look better on the leaderboard. He just hits the favorite button every time he's read something in the back catalog, so he knows if he stumbles on the link not to reread it. That seems like the only way to really manage this stuff, other than having some CRM that you use just to manage your email newsletters, which strikes me as a little bit excessive. Anyway, so that's some thoughts on frequency. But in terms of how to do it, my actual system fluctuates all the time, but it generally just involves a lot of reading. I save to Instapaper everything I think would be worth linking to, and then I read it more carefully and save it to the Instapaper favorites if I'm going to actually link to it. And then I just go through Instapaper I write everything in Emacs, Instapaper, Emacs, just putting in links, adding commentary. And then for the longer form pieces, it's just stuff that's been rattling around in my brain. There was a while where I actually had no backlog. And so there were a couple weeks where every morning I would have to come up with something to write about at length by that evening. And I was able to, which is good. And now I do have a bit of a backlog. So I have this list of topics I want to dive into, haven't had time to yet. One of the troubles with the backlog, though, is there's this effort centrifuge thing going on where if you make a long list of all the things you could work on and you are out of ideas, you want to write something today, you're going to go down the list and do the first one you think you can get done today. And what that means is that you're going down the list, and when you get to an easy one, it gets off the list, which means that the average difficulty of the list keeps going up. And the further down the list something is, the more daunting it is to do. So at the bottom of my to-do list is I want to read one book about the life of Stalin and one book about this Russian city that Stalin created, and want to figure out why American management gurus weren't looking at Russia's GDP growth and saying we should all be like Russia, or figuring out if they were trying to do that. Because there were a lot of books about Japan in the 70s and 80s saying we all need to work like Japan. There are some works about China in the 2010s and 2000 and 2020s that are like, this is how Chinese companies operate, and we need to be cognizant of this, and there are things we can learn from and do. And I want to figure out if anyone did that for Russia in the USSR, because it was also a rapidly growing economy in the early days. But that's going to be a ton of work, and it's going to be very high noise, low signal for that post. So that one, it'll be a while. At some point I'll get to it, but it will get done. So anyway, the centrifuge is just, it's something to be aware of, that your to-do list is going to get more and more daunting over time because of the stuff you skip. And one thing that I try to do is, because I've noticed the list just keeps getting heftier and heftier, is every week I will look at the bottom of the list and figure out what is something difficult that if I spent 2 weeks working on it, I could actually get it done. And then I try to publish it in 2 weeks. So that is at least a way to chip away at that list. But a lot of what I'm doing is just managing these short-term motivational ebbs and flows, that I know that sometimes it's hard to focus, but I can just go through the newsreader, look at recent happenings, and at least note stuff to read about in more detail later. Sometimes I have unbroken blocks of time for reading, so I do some reading. Sometimes I know what my first sentence should be for the main write-up, and so I start that write-up. You do want to, if you get yourself in a position where you're going to have catalysts to do different parts of the work at different times, then just statistically you will end up doing all of it, even though the actual day-to-day process is going to fluctuate.
I love that. And Yichi, I'm actually going to get to your question in a sec because I've got a few follow-ups that I think will tie in nicely with it. But riffing off of that, Kyla asked, have you thought of another format for some of your work? Given that you have a lot of these great ideas baked into the writing, have you thought about YouTube, a podcast, any other like mediums to really invest time into?
I do a subscriber call sometimes, so I'll just do a video chat with subscribers. I found that there's more interest in those when either I have a guest or I am doing a quarterly review of the Diff as a business. Or I did one on GameStop, and that was pretty fun. got a lot of attention. A lot of subscribers signed up for that one. Occasionally, if there's something happening, those are really good. But other times, it's just not great. YouTube is not really my medium. I'm just not that much of a video guy. Like I almost never watch videos. I used to subscribe to Real Vision, which is an all video service, but they do have transcripts. And I found that I was only reading the transcripts. I would never watch an interview with a hedge fund manager if I can read it instead. It's just not something I like that much. So it's not something I do. For podcasts, the tough thing about podcasts is actually coming up with well-rehearsed content and being able to do it as a podcast. I've thought about podcasting my newsletters. I'm not sure if that works perfectly, but people have asked about that. So I may end up doing that or just having someone read them dramatically. The really nice thing about going on somebody else's podcast is that they do all of the preparation work. And if they do the preparation work by reading the recent backlog of the Diff, then I actually know all of the stuff that they're going to ask questions about. Those are really high return on investment for me, and I really enjoy them, in part because I do get some one-on-one, like one-to-one reader feedback. Sometimes people will leave comments, sometimes people will tweet questions, but just talking to someone who has read a bunch of stuff and come up with questions based on the totality of what they've read, the questions will be a lot deeper. I'd like that as a medium, but I think with a lot of businesses, you want to divide things into what are you going to charge the maximum amount for and just try to get the best economics possible. And what do you think is a complement to that? And if it's a complement, then you want to make it free.
I love it. Yeah. And I almost see this factor of what are the mediums where you really feel comfortable and feel like you can naturally pick up onto it. Because it is hard to, if you love making videos, it might be very hard for you to write long form essays. So I see some of that too. And cool. So I want to bring Yishu's question in because I've got some follow-ups on this just generally about the rise of these new creator platforms. And specifically, I guess we'll start with Clubhouse. So curious to hear your thoughts or reactions to the rise of Clubhouse. And there's a few other follow-ups I'm going to add onto this, but let's start with his question.
Yeah, so I like Clubhouse a lot. I think it's really fun. I haven't done a ton of it, but when I've done Clubhouse chats, I've just had a really good time. And I think they're really free flowing. Clubhouse is in this weird state, though, where it used to be everyone's saying everything. Everyone is saying all the things they're not going to say on Twitter because they know that they're not going to get screenshotted, retweeted, all of this terrible stuff. And then, of course, people started recording Clubhouses or just live tweeting. Here's what somebody said. And sometimes the live tweets are totally wrong, but they're very viral, especially if they happen to be wrong in a really attention grabbing way. Clubhouse is getting weird and annoying. I think it might be one of those media where you use it specifically to get slightly negative but very large attention, and you know that if you get called out for saying something and it just sounds dumber than people think you would actually be, that probably there's real context and the context is more interesting, so people are going to try to read the context instead. Maybe that's what Clubhouse is for now, but it is just hard to measure the stakes of having a really free-flowing Clubhouse discussion. That said, I think it is a neat platform in part because it just shows that we haven't actually figured out everything about online communications, that there was actually another social network waiting to be built, and it's a fun one. I think a lot of media go through these cycles where at first it's really open and really fun and really exciting, but as it gets bigger, anything that happens on it is bigger news because it's a big deal. And as it gets bigger, more bad things are likely to happen on it. So all of them end up with stricter moderation over time just because of that problem, that basically negative attention will expand at the square of the growth rate. And Clubhouse is still going to have to figure that stuff out. I also think the live zero latency conversational medium, it's a good one. Twitter had some of that, and that was part of Twitter's early growth, was that you could say things just into the ether that someone can read in a year or two. You can also say things that someone can respond to in seconds. So it was a really powerful tool for tracking current events, for having these rapid back and forth discussions with people. And that's why it grew. So Clubhouse has that. It's faster because the latency for audio is going to be shorter than the latency for text. You can talk over people, which is even faster than replying to them. So I think that makes it pretty cool. There are definitely going to be some people who are just really good at Clubhouse and better at it than they were at other media. So it's like the thing they were waiting for. I think you could take the example of someone like Rush Limbaugh. He died today. He was just an exceptional radio entertainer among many other things that were not so good, but he was able to talk for several hours at a time, just riffing on stuff. There are people who are like that, where they're not really good at much else, or they don't have they're not great entertainers in other ways, but they can just keep going on whatever topic you give them and they can improvise. And I think that is a special talent a lot of people don't necessarily have, and that Clubhouse is going to tap into that. And yeah, I guess that's my dark bull case on Clubhouse, is that is where the next Rush Limbaugh is waiting in the wings. He's coming for you.
That's right. God help us all. I love your point about this almost like new class of creators, people who maybe thrive in these certain mediums. I think maybe we're seeing it to some extent on TikTok, which is like strange yet familiar. And certain people are just really figuring it out in a way that's just more fun than any YouTube video I've seen, and yet a little bit alien and new. I'm curious about this applied to newsletters, and specifically something like Substack, which I think has done this amazing job of creating this narrative around independent writers being able to make a living full time from their work. Anybody who has compelling writing and interesting subject matter expertise being able to monetize and build an audience. But on the other hand, the reality is they're not able to really meaningfully impact distribution. So a lot of writers end up having to develop like marketing skills, for example. And I guess I'm just curious, just generally, it's funny because you're obviously living this. So maybe on one hand, your opinion's obvious, but I'm curious just generally what you think the potential is with the Substack narrative, if there really will be this kind of new class of independent writers, a meaningful number of them able to make a living doing this, or if you're really an outlier, it's going to be very hard. And when the rubber hits the road, it's tough to do.
Yeah, there is a long tail of media that you wouldn't have a lot of exposure to day to day, but that can be very lucrative for the people who do it. So, trade magazines, for example, there are in pretty much any industry, there's going to be a set of publications that have terrible production values. They're often full of ads, but they tell you everything you actually need to know to make decisions in that industry. And the companies that sell those can charge just vast amounts of money because everyone who reads them has to read them, and almost no one who reads them is spending their own money on them. Really good combination for having strong pricing power. If you like, there are hedge fund newsletters that are just, here are the hedge funds that are launching, here's how much they're raising, here's who their lawyers are, here's who their prime brokers are, etc. These magazines can charge just thousands of dollars a year because if you are, say, managing a pension fund and part of your mandate is look at every hedge fund that's launching and have an accurate opinion on whether or not it's worth investing in, then you can't afford to miss things. And also, again, it's not your money when that $5,000 invoice comes in. So I think that is part of what will happen for Substack on the long tail of people making a living, but no one, they're only famous to a couple hundred people. There's another category of creators where the Substack model is a lot closer to tipping, or maybe closer to an NPR pledge drive, where it's not like you're actually paying dollars for value received. It's more like, this is someone who creates content that makes your day a little bit better. And for the cost of a cup of coffee, or I guess 2 cups of coffee a month, you can support them. And maybe you'll get a shout out from them. Maybe you will get some other special bonus, but really you're doing it to support them. And that's what you're after. So I think it's weird that Substack would be in the business of disrupting the trade magazine and the NPR tote bag, but that's where they are. And I think with any new medium or new-ish medium or new way of thinking about an existing medium, there are going to be ideas that we just haven't thought of yet that will be really powerful. You can look at maybe Substack discussion threads are like the text version of Clubhouse, where we're going to have this thing that happens where for an hour, everyone on this email list is going to be gathering. We're going to be discussing one topic, trading ideas, making jokes, pushing back on each other's theses, and sharing useful thoughts. And then it's going to dissipate. So that's, if you are on Substack and you create a discussion thread, that it can be like that. It can be like a text version of Clubhouse, which is silly because that it's been technologically possible to do that for a really long time. You could throw up a forum and just say, starting at noon tomorrow, we are all discussing Roaring Kitty and his GameStop thesis, and then we're going to stop. But making it easier does have a qualitative change in what gets done.
Yeah, that was my next question, which is, are there any new, I don't know if you saw the essay token experiment which you'd be the one who'd be able to properly reverse engineer that. But are there any new monetization models on the horizon? Even the idea of maybe paying for an individual edition of the newsletter, one essay, I'm just going to pay $5 to read this one piece. Are there any models that seem promising and seem like they'll play out? Or do you think a lot of this is still very much in its infancy?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to bet against any new model emerging, but the subscription model has been a good model for a really long time. It's been a really good model for any information that people use to make business decisions because they can treat it as an investment that has return. And if you compare the cost of, say, reading a Substack newsletter on semiconductors or on short selling or on corporate governance to the value that you could create for yourself or your employer from one well-chosen issue of that newsletter, it's clear that the return is really high for the people who are getting any kind of return from it. So in that sense, that model, it works well enough that it would be hard to come up with a tweak that would make it better. The NFT thing, I'm still trying to get my head around it because I guess it's like Bitcoin where, at one level, okay, this is worthless. At another level, if people are paying for it, it's not actually worthless. And if part of the thesis of the value is what people pay for it, which is definitely true for modern art, it's definitely true for currencies, then maybe NFTs are a clever way to formalize this and find a better model for paying artists. So, I wouldn't bet against it, but I do think with art there's scarcity value that NFTs sort of extract that from the consumption value, and I'm not sure if those are unbundled enough to really matter. I guess at one level, if someone bought a famous painting and they packed it up and put it in a warehouse for safekeeping, it's not like that painting just dropped in value because they didn't put it on their living room wall. In fact, the painting probably went up in value because it doesn't have all the risks of someone spilling wine on it or the building burning down or whatever. One level, NFTs are just buying into that economic logic, but I'll see where they go. In terms of other stuff like paying for one essay, I I've had people ask to do that, and I usually just forward it to them because I think just not financially, but emotionally, one of the most annoying experiences you can get would be going out of your way to ask to pay $5 for something, paying $5, feeling like you actually got about $2 worth of value, emailing back saying, "This sucked, I want a refund." Like, it's unpleasant for everyone involved, and I try to write a newsletter for people who would be interested in a lot of other things that I write about. In fact, I try to make it like if you are a person who works in social media, the one thing you read about airline IPOs should be the thing I wrote about an airline IPO. And if you are an energy trader and you read one of my pieces about fuel hedging and how that works and why companies do it, then maybe the one interesting thing you read about social media this week should be something I read about social media. Like I want to get generalists who are not restricting their interests, but who do have interests. I want them to be subscribers. So it doesn't really suit my needs to get paid one time for one piece. Whereas it does suit my needs to send someone a sample of a product that I think they would actually like.
Love it. Great answer. Super clear. With 3 minutes on the clock, I have to lob this question this will be our buzzer beater. What are maybe your opinions or perspective on writer collectives, bundling, writers coming together to do the new form of traditional media, if you will? I'm just curious to get your quick perspective there.
Yeah, so bundling is definitely a model that works really well. You can see that in cable, you can see that in Netflix, you can see that in the magazine business, which had a really good half century or so. Where bundling works really well is with content that is entertaining, where it is a way to spend specific blocks of time. Where it works less well is with content that is supposed to get a return, where it's not that you are in the process of consuming content, it's that you are trying to make a decision and you're using something to inform your decision. Because in that case, you're actually placing a high premium on specific data points and a lower premium on general entertainment. I think bundling can work really well for a lot of things, but I think it just the economics break down the more focused and decision oriented you get. In my case, though, I am operating a bundle because I write about a lot of different topics, and some of the newsletters that I read a lot and link to are just much more narrow. And so they are definitely doing we're not bundling everything together. We are just giving one set of readers the information that they absolutely want. We're putting a really high premium on that reader's time. I'm putting a high premium on the reader's time and trying to really fight for it, trying to justify their decision to continue reading the newsletter once they've opened it. And I think that's what a bundle has to do, is it has to continually fight for that attention. And it's definitely winning in terms of cost. But as people get more constrained by time than by cost, then the math changes.
That's such a great distinction. Amazing. Well, I know we're right at time, so I will keep us to the hour, even though I have a mountain of other things I would love to ask you about. Maybe this also goes without saying, but where should people find you? Where should people follow along with your work? I'll let you direct everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Diff.substack.com, DIF.substack.com. Or you can Google me, Byrne Hobart, and it should come up. So I hope to see you all around.
Amazing. And thanks everyone for joining. And Byrne, again, you have survived the storm. You've survived a national crisis to be here. So thanks again for making the time and for all the hard-won wisdom.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. See you, everybody. Have a good night.